The applause reached me before the meaning did. It rolled through the wedding hall in a warm, roaring wave, echoing off crystal glasses and white walls, people rising from their seats as if something sacred had just been announced. My mother stood beneath the soft golden lights, radiant, emotional, holding a stack of documents above her head like a trophy. Her voice cracked with pride as she said almost reverently, "We're giving them our home." For a moment, time stalled. Then the room erupted. Cheers, tears. Someone gasped loudly. My sister fell into her new husband's arms, sobbing as if she had just been handed the future she always deserved. My father smiled the way men do when they believe they've done something noble, something that will be remembered. I sat there, frozen, my fingers locked tightly around the stem of my wine glass. It felt heavier with every second, as if the weight of that moment was slowly being transferred into my hands. No one looked at me. Not one face turned in my direction. No one remembered who had paid for that house when it should have been foreclosed. No one remembered the quiet transfers, the nights spent recalculating my budget so their mortgage wouldn't fail. The years of responsibility that had kept those walls standing. I told myself to breathe. I told myself to smile, to clap, to stay still. I had spent my whole life perfecting that skill, but when my mother lowered those papers and the music swelled again, something inside me shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was sharp and silent, like a line being drawn after years of erasure. And in that instant, I knew this wouldn't stay buried the way everything else had. If you've ever sacrificed quietly, without praise or acknowledgement, you might understand the question that thundered through my mind while everyone else celebrated. What would you do if your sacrifice was taken from you publicly and turned into a gift for someone else? What would you do if years of effort were erased with a smile, a microphone, and applause? Because that's what happened to me. Not behind closed doors, not in a tense family conversation, but in front of a room full of people who clapped for it, who admired it, who believed it was beautiful. I didn't stand up. I didn't interrupt. I didn't scream or cry or expose the truth. I smiled. I applauded when everyone else applauded. I played my role perfectly. And that's where this story begins, not with an explosion, but with restraint. Because what followed wasn't chaos. It wasn't revenge fueled by rage. It was boundaries. It was confrontation. It was police involvement. It was justice delivered quietly, without cruelty, without shouting, without needing anyone's approval. This isn't a story about burning bridges in anger. It's a story about letting them collapse under their own weight. I have always been the responsible one. The invisible child, the one people describe as low maintenance, as if needing nothing is a compliment rather than a warning sign. Growing up, my sister was the sun in our family's orbit. Emotional, expressive, always needing reassurance, attention, space to fall apart. I was the opposite. The planner, the fixer, the one who learned early that being dependable meant being overlooked. When something needed to be handled, I handled it. When expectations weren't met, I adjusted. When disappointment came, I swallowed it quietly and kept moving. That dynamic didn't disappear when we became adults. It hardened. When my parents' finances began to crumble years ago, when my father's work hours were cut and my mother's health made even driving painful, the mortgage became an unspoken crisis. There were no family meetings, no dramatic pleas, just silence and stress hanging in the air. I didn't hesitate. I opened my laptop, logged into my bank account, and set up a recurring transfer. The first payment felt heavy. The second felt necessary. By the 6th month, it had faded into the background of my life, constant and unnoticed, like the hum of an appliance you only hear when it stops. Every month, my phone buzzed with the same notification: payment processed. No thank you calls. No acknowledgement. Sometimes my mother would mention how lucky they were things hadn't fallen apart yet, and I would nod, not reminding her that the luck had a name and a routing number attached to it. I rearranged my budget. I passed on trips. I closed off small comforts without complaint. It felt like duty, like what adult children were supposed to do. No spotlight, no praise, just responsibility folded neatly into the rhythm of everyday life. The imbalance had always been there, long before the house. When I graduated college, my parents handed me a card at breakfast. Inside was a folded bill, $50. They told me they were proud of me. I thanked them and went to work. 2 years later, when my sister graduated, they threw a backyard party with lights strung between the trees, rented speakers, relatives spilling across the lawn. At the end of the night, my father dangled a pair of car keys in front of her, letting them catch the sunlight. Everyone cheered. She cried into his chest. I clapped with everyone else, pretending not to feel the difference settle inside me like a stone. As adults, the pattern only grew clearer. My sister drifted through jobs, hobbies, relationships, always cushioned by my parents' attention. They called her every morning and every night. When she overspent, they wired money. When she cried, the world rearranged itself around her tears. When I quietly kept their mortgage paid, rearranged my life, kept everything afloat, no one asked how I was managing. They didn't brag about me. They didn't worry about me. I became the invisible support beam of a house that wasn't even mine. That's why the house was never just a house. It was 5 years of effort, 5 years of silence, 5 years of choosing responsibility over recognition. That wedding announcement didn't just give my sister a home, it erased my role in keeping it alive. It told me, publicly and unmistakably, exactly where I stood in my own family. This story isn't about money. It's about what happens when quiet sacrifice is mistaken for obligation. It's about the moment the dependable child finally stops bending. It's about how justice doesn't always arrive with shouting or revenge, but sometimes with a single word, no, and the resolve to stand by it, no matter who is watching. The applause reached her before the meaning did. It wasn't polite clapping or scattered cheers. It was full-bodied, explosive, the kind of sound that fills a room so completely it presses against your chest. Chairs scraped back. Glasses clinked. Someone whistled. Claire Whitman sat perfectly still at a round table near the back of the wedding hall, her fingers wrapped tightly around the stem of her wineglass as if it were the only solid thing left in the room. Her mother stood beneath the wedding lights, face glowing, eyes wet with emotion, holding a stack of documents above her head like a sacred offering. The white paper caught the light as she lifted it higher, her voice trembling with pride and certainty. "We're giving them our home," she said. For half a second, Claire didn't understand the sentence. Her mind stalled on the words, trying to rearrange them into something else. Then the room erupted. Cheers burst from every direction. Her younger sister Lily let out a broken sob and collapsed into her new husband's arms, shaking with happiness. Their father stood beside their mother, chest out, smiling the way men smile when they believe they've done something noble, something that will be remembered. Someone shouted, "That's incredible." Another voice called, "Best parents ever." Claire smiled automatically. She had perfected that reflex years ago. Smile. Stay quiet. Don't disrupt the moment. No one looked at her. Not one face turned. Not one person noticed the way her grip tightened around the glass, the way her jaw locked to keep her expression in place. No one remembered who had paid that mortgage when the bank letters started arriving. No one remembered the quiet transfers, the missed trips, the nights she sat alone recalculating her budget so the payment wouldn't fail. The house was being celebrated like a gift from nowhere, conjured out of love and generosity, as if it hadn't been kept alive by 5 years of her silence. She told herself to breathe. This wasn't the time. This wasn't the place. This was just another moment she could swallow. But when her mother lowered the papers and the applause faded into music again, something inside Claire shifted. Not violently. Not dramatically. It was clean and sharp, like a bone finally cracking after years of pressure. A realization settling so deeply it didn't need words. She understood, in that moment, exactly where she stood. Claire had always been the responsible one. The invisible child. The one people described as low maintenance, as if needing nothing were a compliment instead of a quiet warning sign. Growing up, Lily had been the sun in their family's orbit. Emotional, expressive, always needing reassurance, always being met with it. Claire was the opposite. She learned early that being dependable meant being overlooked. When something broke, she fixed it. When plans fell apart, she adjusted. When expectations weren't met, she absorbed the disappointment quietly and moved on. No one asked her to do that. They simply came to expect it. That expectation followed her into adulthood like gravity. 5 years earlier, when her father's work hours were cut and her mother's health declined so badly she could barely drive, the mortgage became an unspoken crisis. No one sat Claire down. No one asked directly. The stress just filled the house, heavy and constant, waiting for someone to relieve it. Claire didn't hesitate. She opened her laptop one night after work, logged into her bank account, and set up a recurring transfer. The first payment felt heavy. The second felt necessary. By the 6th month, it slipped into the background of her life like the hum of an appliance you only notice when it stops. Every 30 days, her phone buzzed. Payment processed. No thank you calls. No acknowledgement. No conversation. Sometimes her mother would sigh and say how lucky they were that things hadn't fallen apart. Claire would nod, not reminding her that luck had a name, an account number, and a monthly sacrifice attached to it. She rearranged her budget quietly, passed on trips without complaint, closed off small comforts she never replaced. It felt like duty, like what adult children were supposed to do. The imbalance had always existed, long before money entered the picture. When Claire graduated college, her parents handed her a card at breakfast. Inside was a folded $50 bill. They told her they were proud. She thanked them and went to work. 2 years later, when Lily graduated, there was a backyard party. Lights strung between trees. Music. Relatives spilling across the lawn. At the end of the night, her father dangled a pair of car keys in front of Lily, letting them catch the sunlight. "Your car's in the driveway," he said. Everyone cheered. Lily cried into his chest. Claire clapped with everyone else, pretending not to feel the difference settle inside her like a stone. That was the day Claire learned exactly where she stood. And 5 years later, under wedding lights and applause, that lesson finally came due. After the wedding, Claire went back to her seat and stayed there until the night ended. She laughed when someone spoke to her. She posed for photos. She hugged relatives who told her how beautiful everything was. She congratulated Lily again, kissed her cheek, and told her how happy she looked. Her voice didn't crack, her hands didn't shake. No one would have guessed anything was wrong. That was the skill she had perfected over a lifetime, carrying weight without letting it show. On the drive home, the city lights blurred against the windows as Mark drove, one hand steady on the wheel. He didn't ask questions right away. He never did. He knew Claire needed silence before she needed words. The quiet in the car wasn't tense or fragile. It was dense, like something settling into place. When they reached their apartment, Claire hung up her coat, kicked off her shoes, and went straight to the bathroom. She turned on the cold water and pressed her palms against the sink, staring at her reflection. Her face looked calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes when something inside you has finally stopped trying to negotiate. She thought about the house, the chipped paint on the back steps she had helped repair. The winter she paid 2 extra months ahead because her father's hours were cut again. The way her mother used to say, "We don't know what we'd do without you," and how those words never turned into action. For 5 years, that house had been a responsibility she carried quietly. She never called it hers, Even in her head, she never asked for recognition, she never asked for anything at all. But she had assumed, foolishly, she realized now, that sacrifice meant something. That effort was seen, even if it wasn't celebrated. The wedding proved otherwise. In the weeks that followed, the silence from her parents was strange. Not apologetic, not awkward. Normal. As if nothing had changed. As if the announcement hadn't rewritten years of reality. Her mother texted photos from the honeymoon. Her father sent updates about the weather. Lily sent excited messages about paint colors and furniture ideas. Claire read them all. She replied politely. She didn't argue. She didn't confront anyone. Not yet. Because confrontation wasn't her instinct. Observation was. She noticed how easily they talked about the house now, how casually Lily said our place, how her parents spoke about downsizing and starting fresh, as if the past 5 years had been a pleasant blur rather than a lifeline they had leaned on. No one mentioned the mortgage. No one mentioned the money. The story had already been rewritten. And Claire understood something then that changed everything. They hadn't forgotten what she did. They had simply decided it didn't matter. That realization hurt more than anger ever could. 2 months later, Lily invited Claire and Mark to dinner. "Just us," she wrote. "I want to show you what we've done with the place." Claire almost declined. Something in her chest tightened the moment she read the message. But avoidance felt like surrender, and she wasn't ready for that either. They drove out just before sunset. The house looked the same from the outside, but different in ways Claire couldn't immediately name. The porch light glowed warmly. New planters flanked the door. Through the window, she saw her mother adjusting a set of cream-colored curtains. The blue ones she'd loved for years were gone. Inside, Lily moved through the space like she had always belonged there. Her laugh echoed easily. She talked about the future with certainty, pointing out where she wanted a fire pit, how she imagined hosting holidays, how perfect it felt. Claire sat at the table, hands folded, listening. Dinner was comfortable in the way familiarity often is. Pot roast, fresh bread, a game murmuring on the television in the background. Mark chatted politely with Claire's father. Everything looked normal, almost peaceful, and that's when Claire's mother folded her hands on the table. The gesture was small, but Claire recognized it immediately. It was the signal her mother used when something had already been decided. "We wanted to talk to you," her mother said gently. Claire felt it before she heard the words, that quiet tightening behind her ribs. The instinct that told her this conversation wasn't about asking. "Since the house is Lily's now," her father added, nodding, "we need somewhere to stay. Somewhere peaceful." Her mother smiled like she was announcing weekend plans. "We've decided we're going to move into your vacation house." The sentence landed cleanly. Not as a request. Not as a question. As a fact. Claire didn't react immediately. She placed her fork down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the plate. Her hands were steady. Her breath was slow. Inside, something familiar cracked open. Not shock this time, but recognition. They hadn't just erased her sacrifice, they expected her to keep giving. She looked at her parents, at Lily, suddenly very quiet. At Mark, who had gone still beside her. "No," Claire said. The word wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was solid. Her mother blinked. "What?" "You're not moving into my house." The room tilted into stillness. Her father frowned. Lily stared at her plate. For the first time all evening, no one spoke. Claire stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor, a small sound, but final. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't explain. She didn't justify. She simply walked away. And that empty chair at the table, the one she left behind, felt louder than any argument ever could. The drive home that night felt different from any drive Claire had taken before. Not tense, not angry, clean. The kind of silence that settles when something long unresolved finally clicks into place. Mark kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting near hers, close enough to reach but not forcing comfort she hadn't asked for. He didn't ask questions. He didn't fill the space with reassurance. He understood that what had happened at that table wasn't an argument. It was a revelation. Claire stared out the window as streetlights slid past, each one briefly illuminating the reflection of her own face in the glass. Calm. Almost eerily so. She felt like someone who had spent years bracing against a current and had suddenly stepped onto solid ground. The exhaustion wasn't gone, but it had shifted. It no longer felt like something she had to carry forward. It felt like something she could finally set down. When they reached home, she didn't collapse onto the couch or retreat into the bedroom. She moved with intention. She hung her coat, slipped out of her shoes, walked straight to her desk. The lamp cast a narrow circle of light across the surface. Her laptop sat closed at the center, waiting. Claire opened it and let the screen glow to life. There was no rush, no shaking hands, just a sequence of decisions she had rehearsed unconsciously for years. First, contact. She opened her phone and scrolled to her parents' names. She didn't read the most recent messages. She didn't need to. Every cycle with them followed the same pattern: boundary, backlash, guilt, apology, amnesia. She couldn't afford that loop anymore. Block, confirm. The clicks were dull, almost soft. A clean cut disguised as routine. Next, security. She opened the app connected to the vacation house, the place she had bought quietly, responsibly, years earlier, with the intention of someday resting there, not rescuing anyone. The map pin pulsed gently. A thumbnail image of the front porch appeared. System status. Armed. She tightened the settings. New passcode. Two-step verification. Motion alerts increased in sensitivity. She removed every old access code, every digital key, every lingering permission she had once granted out of trust. Notifications rerouted directly to her phone and Mark's. No delays. Then, documentation. She opened a folder labeled simply Records. Inside were 5 years of mortgage payments, not dramatic spreadsheets, just monthly confirmations. Transfer receipts, short notes she had typed to herself late at night when money was tight and reassurance was scarce. The dates formed a rhythm, a pattern, proof that what she felt wasn't imagined. She compressed the folder and saved it somewhere easy to reach, not to weaponize, to anchor herself in truth. Mark leaned against the doorway, watching quietly. "Do you want to talk?" he asked. "Not yet." He nodded and stepped away without offense, without pressure. She loved him most in moments like that. Claire opened a new document, a simple spreadsheet, not revenge, inventory. Every financial obligation she had carried for her parents. Months she covered when they couldn't manage. Times she rearranged her schedule, her plans, her life. Line by line, the numbers appeared, unemotional and precise. When she finished, she closed the file. She didn't save it. Witnessing it was enough. Near midnight, Claire stood by the window. The city glowed below, soft and blurred, traffic humming steadily like a reminder that the world kept moving even when you stopped bending for it. Mark joined her, placing a mug of warm tea on the sill. Their fingers brushed. "You okay?" he murmured. "I think so." They stood there for a long time, breathing in the same slow rhythm. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, Claire felt anchored. The next morning, she woke before the alarm. The clarity was still there. Not brittle. Not fragile. Solid. She showered, tied her hair back, dressed for work. Every movement felt deliberate, as if she were marking a shift beneath her ribs. Before leaving, she paused at the drawer near the door and opened it. Inside lay a small ring of keys. Apartment. Office. And near the center, the vacation house. She picked it up, cold metal, sharp edges. A simple object carrying 5 years of silence, responsibility, and erased effort. She closed her hand around it until the imprint pressed into her palm. Then she placed it back in the drawer. Gently, ceremonially. At work, everything felt sharper, the sound of keyboards, the hum of printers, the low murmur of conversation. She logged in and worked with a focus she hadn't felt in a long time. Around noon, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She didn't open it. She deleted it. Boundaries only worked when maintained. Time passed in clean segments. Afternoon light spilled across her desk. The day moved forward the way days were meant to move, without crisis. When she got home, Mark was reading on the couch. She sat beside him, leaned back, and closed her eyes. Her shoulders dropped. The quiet inside her didn't feel like emptiness anymore. It felt like space. That night, before bed, she checked the security app again. Armed. Stable. Still. She turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness. This time, she wouldn't fix what they had broken. The call came on a Wednesday morning, right in the middle of a meeting Claire had no intention of remembering. The conference room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and dry erase markers, the kind of space where time seemed to stall while people talked in circles. Her phone lay face down on the table, something she normally ignored out of habit. It buzzed once. Then again. The second vibration skittered across the polished surface, just enough to draw her attention. She glanced down, expecting a calendar alert or a message from Mark. Instead, an unfamiliar number filled the screen. She almost declined it. Almost. There was something about the timing, the insistence, that made her push her chair back quietly and step into the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, too bright, too unforgiving. She answered. Hello? There was a pause, then a calm, professional voice. Ma'am. This is Officer Reynolds, with the County Police Department. We're calling regarding a property registered in your name outside the city. Claire leaned back against the wall, the cool surface pressing into her spine. Her heart didn't race. It slowed. Yes, she said. What's going on? We have 2 individuals here who claim to be your parents. They entered the property using a key. Your security system flagged the entry as unauthorized. For a moment, everything sharpened. Not with panic, but with clarity so clean it almost felt like relief. The line she had drawn wasn't theoretical anymore. It had been tested. They don't have permission to be there, Claire said. There was another pause, shorter this time. Understood. We wanted to confirm before proceeding. Would you like to come to the property? Yes, she replied. I'm on my way. She ended the call, slipped back into the meeting room long enough to gather her bag, and walked straight out of the building. She found Mark at his desk 10 minutes later, already standing when he saw her face. They're at the house, she said. He didn't ask who. He grabbed his keys and followed her out without another word. The drive out of the city stretched long and pale under an overcast sky. Traffic thinned as buildings gave way to trees, the noise of the city dissolving into the steady sound of tires on asphalt. Claire sat with her hands folded in her lap, thumbs pressed together, grounding herself in the familiar pressure. She wasn't angry. She wasn't afraid. She felt exactly as she had the night she said no at the dinner table. Certain. When they turned onto the gravel road leading to the vacation house, she saw the police cruiser first. Its lights weren't flashing. It sat quietly near the edge of the driveway, like a witness waiting. 2 officers stood near the porch. And on the steps, beside 3 mismatched suitcases, sat her parents. Her mother looked up first. Relief flooded her face instantly, as if Claire's presence alone meant the situation would be undone. She stood quickly, brushing dust from her coat. Thank God, she said, hurrying forward. Tell them it's fine. Tell them we're allowed to be here. The officer stepped slightly to the side, giving Claire a clear line of sight. "Ma'am, are these your parents?" "Yes," Claire said. Her voice was steady. "And they do not have permission to be on the property." The air seemed to tighten. Her mother's face crumpled, confusion bleeding into disbelief. "Claire, don't do this," she said, her voice dropping into the tone she used when she expected compliance. "We had nowhere else to go." "You had a home," Claire replied. "You gave it away." Her father stood slowly, brushing imaginary dirt from his jacket, irritation flickering across his face. "We didn't break in," he said. "We used the key you gave us." "That key was for emergencies," Claire said, "not for moving in." Silence stretched between them, thin and brittle. The trees stood still. The gravel settled beneath their feet. Claire could hear her own breathing, slow and even. The officer cleared his throat. "We can escort them off the property. If you'd like to press charges for trespassing, we can file that as well." Her mother inhaled sharply. "You wouldn't," she whispered. Claire looked at her then. Really looked. At the expectation layered so deeply into her expression, at the certainty that Claire would bend the way she always had, at the belief that responsibility meant surrender. "I'm not pressing charges," Claire said quietly. "But they cannot stay here." Relief flickered across her mother's face too quickly, misunderstanding the boundary even now. The officer nodded. "We'll take them to the station for a few hours. They can arrange transportation from there." Her mother turned on Claire then, anger snapping into place where gratitude should have been. "You're unbelievable," she said. "After everything we've done for you." Mark stepped slightly closer to Claire, not as a shield, but as a reminder. She wasn't alone. The officers guided her parents toward the cruiser. The suitcases remained on the porch like abandoned thoughts. Dust lifted as the car pulled away, drifting into the late afternoon light. A locksmith arrived shortly after. He nodded politely, changed the locks efficiently, handed Claire a new set of keys. Cold metal. Solid. Real. She slipped them into her pocket. Before leaving, she walked up the porch steps and unlocked the door herself. The house was exactly as she had left it. Quiet. Untouched. She locked it again, the click echoing cleanly through the still air. Justice didn't need noise. It only needed clarity. The drive home was silent, but not heavy. When they reached the apartment, the city felt different, less demanding, less loud. That night, Claire slept deeply, without rehearsing conversations or bracing for impact. The next morning, the world felt strangely weightless. She woke before the alarm, brewed coffee, and stood by the window watching early lights soften the city's edges. Mark joined her, their hands brushing as they reached for their mugs. No words were needed. Later that day, a cousin called with updates. Her parents had tried to return to Lily's house. Lily had refused to let them in. They were renting a small apartment now. Her mother had gone back to work full-time. Claire listened without reacting. Not out of cruelty, but distance. The kind that comes after years of carrying something heavy and finally setting it down. That evening, her phone buzzed with a voicemail from her mother. The voice sounded smaller than Claire remembered. Apologies. Regret. A request to talk. Claire didn't delete it. She didn't listen to it either. Some apologies needed time before they could be heard. After dinner, she opened her laptop and pulled up the rental listing for the vacation house. The photos appeared, sunlit rooms, quiet spaces. For the first time, she looked at it without resentment. Just ownership. Choice. She adjusted a few details, clicked list, and closed the laptop. That night, as she turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like freedom. And for the first time in her life, Claire knew she wouldn't give it up again. The days that followed didn't explode the way Claire once imagined conflict would. There were no screaming phone calls once the blocking held, no dramatic confrontations on her doorstep. No late-night emergencies demanding she step back into the role she had finally set down. Instead, there was something far more unsettling at first. Calm. Not peace. Calm. It took her a few days to trust it. She went to work, answered emails, sat through meetings, and noticed how much energy she had been spending for years just bracing for impact. Without that constant vigilance, the hours felt longer, clearer. She caught herself pausing in the middle of tasks, surprised by how quiet her thoughts were. No running commentary of what she should fix next. No mental checklist of other people's problems waiting for her attention. At night, she slept deeply. The kind of sleep that doesn't feel earned through exhaustion, but arrives naturally when your body no longer expects to be woken by crisis. Still, the silence had weight. One evening, while she and Mark were clearing the table after dinner, her phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. Another unknown number. She didn't pick it up immediately. She dried her hands, leaned against the counter, and stared at the phone as if it were a test she could choose whether or not to take. Mark watched her quietly. "You don't have to listen," he said. "I know," she replied, and for the first time, she meant it. When she finally pressed play later that night, her mother's voice sounded older than Claire remembered. Thinner. Less certain. There was no anger this time. Just regret wrapped in justification. Apologies tangled with explanations. Mentions of sacrifice, of misunderstandings, of how families are supposed to support each other. Claire listened all the way through without interruption. When it ended, she didn't cry. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt something closer to grief, not for what had happened, but for what never had. The acknowledgement she had wanted for years was still missing. Even now, the apology centered on discomfort, not accountability. She deleted the voicemail. That choice surprised her, not because it was cruel, but because it felt clean. Like closing a book after the final page, not slamming it shut. A week later, her cousin Jessica invited her to lunch. They sat across from each other in a small cafe, sunlight pooling between them on the table. Jessica spoke carefully, as if every sentence might be misinterpreted. "They're struggling," she said finally. "Your parents. I think they didn't expect things to turn out like this." Claire stirred her coffee slowly. "They expected me to fix it," Jessica nodded. "Yeah, they did." There it was, spoken plainly, not defended, not softened. Claire realized then that she had spent years waiting for someone to say that out loud. To name the expectation that had shaped her entire role in the family. Hearing it now didn't reopen the wound. It sealed it. She didn't ask for updates after that. She didn't need them. Whatever lessons her parents were learning, they were no longer hers to teach. Life began to reorganize itself around the absence of obligation. Claire took a weekend trip she had postponed for years. She spent money without guilt. She made plans that didn't account for anyone else's emergencies. Each small choice felt unfamiliar at first, like using muscles that had gone unused for too long. One afternoon, she received a message from Lily. It wasn't angry. It wasn't apologetic either. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," Lily wrote. Claire stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she typed back, "I didn't think you'd need me to." The conversation ended there. That night, Claire walked through her apartment slowly, noticing details she had rushed past before. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt intentional, chosen. She understood something then that reframed everything. Justice hadn't arrived as punishment. It had arrived as consequence, not imposed by her, but revealed by reality itself. Her parents weren't homeless because she had said no. They were displaced because of choices made long before that night at the wedding. Lily hadn't lost anything she hadn't already been given too much of. Claire hadn't taken anything away. She had simply stopped giving. Weeks later, standing at the window again, watching the city lights blur into gold, Claire felt something settle that she hadn't expected. Forgiveness. Not for them. For herself. For the years she spent believing that love meant erasing her own needs. For mistaking endurance for virtue. For staying silent long after silence became self-betrayal. She rested her forehead lightly against the glass and breathed. Freedom, she realized, isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, the way truth often does, when you finally stop arguing with it. And this time, the silence wasn't something she had to survive. It was something she had chosen. Time has a way of revealing truth without asking permission. Weeks passed, then months, and the chaos that once felt so loud began to fade into something distant and manageable. Claire stopped measuring her days by what might go wrong or who might need her next. Mornings became calmer. Decisions became lighter. She noticed how much space opened up in her life when she stopped carrying burdens that were never meant to be hers. Her parents tried, in their own way, to rebuild. They struggled more than they expected to. Living small didn't come easily to people who had always believed someone else would catch them. Claire heard fragments of their situation through extended family, missed comforts, strained finances, quiet resentment. Not suffering, exactly, but consequence. The kind that doesn't shout but insists on being felt. For the first time, life was asking them to live with the weight of their own choices. Lily's world changed too. Without the safety net she had always relied on, things didn't glide the way they once had. Her marriage faced pressures she had never prepared for. Bills felt heavier without backup. The house, once a symbol of celebration, became a reminder of responsibility she hadn't earned, but now had to maintain. Claire didn't take satisfaction in this. She took clarity. Some lessons don't come from punishment. They come from reality finally being allowed to speak. One evening, Claire found herself alone in the quiet, sitting at the same desk where she had once documented years of sacrifice. She opened that old folder again, not to relive the past, but to release it. She scrolled through the payment confirmations, the dates marking time she had given without question. This time, she didn't feel anger or grief, she felt closure. Proof that she hadn't imagined the imbalance. Proof that her response hadn't been cruel. It had been proportional. She closed the folder and deleted it. Not because it wasn't true, but because she no longer needed to prove it to herself. That night, she stepped outside onto the balcony and looked up at the sky. The city lights dulled the stars, but she could still see a few, steady and distant. Claire had never believed justice always arrived quickly or loudly. But she believed, now more than ever, that there was a quiet order to things, that when people insist on taking what isn't theirs, life eventually asks for repayment in ways no one can avoid. She thought about the wedding night again, not with pain, but with distance. What had once felt like public erasure now looked like exposure. A moment that revealed everyone exactly as they were. Her parents need to be admired. Lily's comfort with receiving without question, and her own willingness, finally, to stop disappearing. Claire hadn't set out to punish anyone. She hadn't planned revenge. She had simply stepped out of the role God never intended her to play, the savior who sacrifices herself so others never have to grow. And the moment she stepped aside, the truth rushed in to fill the space. That, she realized, was justice. Not fire. Not humiliation. Not cruelty. But balance. The world had corrected itself the moment she stopped interfering. In time, her parents stopped calling. Lily stopped reaching out. The silence that remained was not empty. It was respectful. Earned. Claire filled it with things that belonged to her, travel, rest, laughter that didn't cost her anything. She learned that love offered freely is a gift, but love demanded through guilt is a debt that never ends. On a quiet Sunday morning, Claire sat with Mark, sunlight spilling across the floor, coffee growing cold between them. He looked at her and smiled in a way that told her he saw the change, not as distance, but as strength. "You're lighter," he said. "I stopped carrying what wasn't mine," she replied. And in that simple truth, everything finally made sense. God's justice didn't arrive with thunder. It arrived with clarity, with consequence, with the steady return of dignity. Claire didn't lose her family. She lost an illusion. And in its place, she gained something far more lasting: peace. And that peace, unlike the house, was something no one could ever take from her again. There was a moment, months later, when Claire realized she hadn't thought about the house in days. Not the wedding hall, not the applause, not the way her mother's voice had cracked with pride while lifting papers that erased years of her life. The memory didn't sting anymore. It sat where old memories sit, present, but no longer powerful. That realization surprised her more than anything else had. She noticed it on an ordinary afternoon. She was standing in a bookstore, leafing through a novel she didn't need, sunlight slanting across the wooden floor. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. For a split second, muscle memory tensed her shoulders, the old reflex of anticipating crisis. Then she remembered there was nothing waiting to be fixed. No emergency, no obligation disguised as love. The tension dissolved before it could fully form. That was when she understood what freedom actually felt like. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was ease. Her parents' lives continued, quieter and smaller than before. Through distant relatives, she heard they argued more now. That money was tighter. That resentment lingered in places where entitlement once lived comfortably. They blamed circumstances, each other, sometimes even God. But they never named the truth, that they had built their sense of security on the quiet assumption that Claire would always absorb the cost. Lily struggled too. The house required upkeep. Marriage demanded compromise she hadn't practiced. Without constant rescue, problems no longer dissolved on their own. Claire didn't watch this unfold with satisfaction. She watched it with understanding. People grow only when they're allowed to feel the weight of their own choices. And for the first time, she let them. One evening, Claire received a letter in the mail. Not a text. Not a voicemail. A letter. Handwritten. Her mother's familiar looping script covering the page. Claire sat at the kitchen table for a long time before opening it, fingers resting lightly on the envelope. The words inside weren't dramatic. There was no confession, no full accountability. But there was something new. Acknowledgement. Not of the money, not of the house, but of Claire herself, her steadiness, her sacrifice, her silence. It wasn't enough to repair what had broken, but it was enough to release what still lingered. Claire folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that truth, once spoken, continues to work long after the voice goes quiet. That night, she stepped out onto the balcony again, the city humming below. She thought about how long she had mistaken endurance for virtue. How often she had believed being needed was the same as being loved. How deeply she had internalized the idea that responsibility meant self-erasure. God, she realized, never asked her to disappear. God had simply waited for her to stop doing it herself. Justice hadn't come through confrontation or humiliation. It hadn't arrived through victory or applause. It came through alignment, when her actions finally matched her worth. When she stopped playing a role that drained her and stepped into one that honored her. She hadn't taken revenge. She had reclaimed herself. And that reclamation shifted everything else into place. Claire turned back inside, closing the door softly behind her. The apartment felt warm, lived in, whole. Mark looked up from the couch and smiled, the kind of smile that needed no explanation. She smiled back. Some stories end with celebration, some end with forgiveness. This one ended with something quieter and far more powerful. Peace. And peace, Claire now knew, was the clearest sign that justice had been done, exactly as it was meant to be. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after everything ended. Claire never expected it to. What changed wasn't the world around her, but the way she moved through it. She no longer woke up with a low-grade tension humming beneath her ribs, the constant awareness that something might break and she would be the one expected to fix it. That hum had been there for so long, she once mistook it for normal. Its absence felt almost disorienting at first, like stepping off a boat after years at sea. She noticed the change in small moments, standing in line at the grocery store without mentally calculating how much extra she could afford to send someone that month. Booking a weekend trip without checking a calendar for other people's needs. Saying no casually, without rehearsing explanations in her head or bracing for backlash. Each small act felt radical, not because it was dramatic, but because it was hers. People around her noticed too. Friends commented that she seemed calmer, lighter, more present. At work, she found herself speaking up more often, not out of frustration but confidence. She took on projects she actually wanted, not just the ones no one else would handle. For the first time, her competence wasn't just something others leaned on, it was something she used intentionally. There were moments, of course, when memory tried to pull her backward. A holiday approaching. A song her mother used to hum while cleaning the kitchen. A random photo online of Lily smiling in front of the house. Those moments still carried weight, but they no longer carried command. Claire learned that missing people doesn't mean returning to the harm they caused. Grief and boundaries can coexist. Love and distance can share the same space. One evening, while cleaning out an old box in the closet, Claire found a stack of unpaid bills from years ago, copies she had kept just in case, back when she thought she might need proof to justify her worth. She sat on the floor for a long time, flipping through them. The dates told a story she already knew. This time, instead of tucking them back into the box, she shredded them slowly, one page at a time. Not in anger, in release. She realized then that she no longer needed evidence of what she had given. Her life reflected it now. Her peace reflected it. God had already balanced the scales in ways no spreadsheet ever could. Mark watched her through all of this with quiet steadiness. Their relationship deepened, not through crisis, but through shared calm. They planned for the future with clarity instead of contingency. They talked about dreams without attaching them to rescue missions. Love felt simpler when it wasn't competing with obligation. On a quiet Sunday morning, Claire returned to the vacation house alone. Not because she had to check on it, but because she wanted to. She opened the windows, let fresh air move through the rooms, and sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee, listening to the wind in the trees. The house felt different now. Not like a responsibility. Like a choice. She thought about how close she had come to losing herself completely in the role others assigned her. How easily she could have continued paying, fixing, smoothing, disappearing, because everyone would have let her. That was the hardest truth of all. People don't stop you from sacrificing yourself. They benefit from it. But God, she believed, does not reward self-erasure. God honors truth, alignment, courage that doesn't shout but stands firm. As the sun climbed higher, Claire felt something settle gently inside her. Not pride, not triumph, but gratitude. Gratitude that she had listened when something inside her finally said enough. Gratitude that she had chosen herself before bitterness had time to take root. Gratitude that justice had arrived not as punishment, but as restoration. She locked the door when she left, not out of fear, but respect, for herself and for the life she had reclaimed. Somewhere along the way, Claire stopped being the invisible support beam. She became the foundation of her own life. And that, she knew now, was the only role she was ever meant to play. The world kept moving. Her family's story continued without her at its center, and for the first time, that was exactly as it should be. Because sometimes the greatest ending isn't reconciliation. It's freedom. The silence that followed wasn't empty, and it wasn't lonely. It was intentional. Claire learned to recognize the difference. Empty silence echoes, intentional silence holds. It gives you room to hear your own thoughts without interruption, to notice the shape of your life without other people's expectations pressed into it. For the first time, she wasn't waiting for the next demand, the next crisis disguised as love. She was simply living. She began to understand how deeply the old patterns had lived inside her, how often she had equated usefulness with worth, endurance with goodness, sacrifice with love. Those beliefs didn't vanish overnight. They surfaced sometimes in subtle ways, an impulse to over-explain a no, a flicker of guilt when she chose herself without permission. But now, she noticed them. And noticing was power. Each time the old reflex appeared, she paused, breathed, and chose differently. One afternoon, while walking through a park near her apartment, Claire watched a child learning to ride a bike. The parent jogged alongside, hands hovering close but not touching, allowing the child to wobble, correct, and try again. When the child finally pedaled forward on their own, the parent didn't grab the handlebars. They stepped back and smiled. The image struck her so sharply she had to stop walking. Support without control, care without possession. Love that didn't demand surrender. She realized how rare that had been in her own life, and how committed she was to building it now. Her parents stopped trying to reach her after a while. Not dramatically, not with closure. They simply faded into the background of her days, like a noise you eventually stop noticing once it's gone. Lily's name came up less and less. The house remained where it was, a fact of geography rather than a symbol of injustice. Claire stopped checking updates. She stopped measuring outcomes. Justice, she had learned, wasn't a scoreboard. Occasionally, someone would ask if she regretted it, if she wished she had handled things differently, if it was worth it. Claire never answered immediately. Not because she doubted herself, but because the truth deserved care. When she did respond, it was always the same. Said calmly and without defensiveness, "I regret staying silent for so long. I don't regret stopping." That answer felt true in her bones. On an ordinary evening, months after everything had settled, Claire and Mark sat on the floor assembling a piece of furniture they'd put off buying for years. They laughed at the instructions, argued lightly about which screw went where, and finished with crooked pride. It was a small moment, insignificant to anyone else. To Claire, it felt like proof. Life built by choice, not obligation. Joy that didn't come with strings attached. Later, as she turned off the lights and prepared for bed, Claire caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked the same, and yet not. Her shoulders were looser, her eyes steadier. She saw someone who trusted herself now, someone who no longer needed permission to take up space. She whispered a quiet thank you, not to anyone else, but to the part of herself that had finally stood up under wedding lights and applause and chosen truth over erasure, to the courage that didn't shout, to the boundary that held. Some people call stories like hers revenge stories. Claire knew better. Revenge seeks to wound. What she had done was refuse to bleed any longer. What followed wasn't destruction. It was alignment. And alignment has a way of letting consequences fall exactly where they belong. She slept easily that night, and when morning came, it didn't demand anything from her. It simply arrived, open, honest, and hers. The truth is, closure didn't arrive as a single moment. It came in layers, unfolding quietly as Claire continued to live inside the life she had reclaimed. Some mornings, it showed up as relief. Other days, it arrived as understanding. And occasionally, it came as a soft ache, not regret, but remembrance of the person she used to be, the one who believed love was something you proved by disappearing. She began to notice how often she used to apologize for things that required no apology. Taking time, saying no, needing rest. Now, those apologies no longer slipped from her mouth automatically. When someone asked her for help that felt unreasonable, She paused instead of reacting. She asked herself a question she had never been allowed to ask before. Do I want to do this? Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes it wasn't. Either way, the choice belonged to her. There were moments when the past tried to resurface unexpectedly. A holiday display in a store. A recipe that reminded her of her mother's kitchen. A house that looked too much like the one she had helped save. In those moments, the old guilt whispered again, asking if she should reach out, if she should soften, if she should fix what had broken. But the whisper no longer controlled her. She had learned that longing does not equal obligation, and memory does not demand return. One evening, while organizing her calendar, Claire realized something that made her smile. For the first time in years, her schedule was filled with things she had chosen purely because they brought her joy. Classes she wanted to take, dinners she wanted to host, trips she had planned without asking anyone's permission. Her life no longer revolved around being needed, it revolved around being present. Mark noticed it too, not in grand gestures, but in the way she laughed more easily now. In how she rested without guilt. In how her decisions came from clarity instead of fear. Their conversations shifted from contingency plans to shared dreams. They talked about the future with openness rather than caution. Love, she realized, feels different when it doesn't require you to be smaller. One afternoon, Claire received a short message from an extended family member she hadn't spoken to in a long time. It wasn't an apology or an accusation, just a simple line, "I see now what you carried for so long." Claire read it once, then set her phone down. That was enough. She didn't need validation, but recognition still mattered. Not because it changed the past, but because it affirmed the truth she had always known. Over time, the story stopped being something she revisited constantly. It became part of her history rather than the center of her identity. She no longer defined herself by what she had endured or what she had walked away from. She defined herself by what she had built afterward. On a quiet evening, as she stood by the window watching the city lights blink on one by one, Claire felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not for the betrayal, not for the pain, but for the moment she finally chose herself. She understood now that God's justice doesn't always look like correction from above. Sometimes it looks like strength rising within, like truth making room for peace, like a life that finally feels aligned. She closed the window, turned off the light, and went to bed without carrying anyone else's weight with her. And that, more than anything else, was the ending she had earned. The truth is, nothing dramatic happened after that. There was no final confrontation, no moment where everyone suddenly understood or apologized or admitted they were wrong. Life didn't circle back to give Claire a neat bow or a speech that made the loss feel smaller. Instead, it did something far more honest. It moved on. And for the first time, it moved on without her being dragged along behind it. Claire stopped waiting for a message that would explain everything. She stopped bracing herself for guilt disguised as concern. She stopped rehearsing conversations that would never bring the closure she once craved. What surprised her most was how natural that felt once she allowed it. Letting go didn't require force, it required permission. Permission she finally gave herself. The children of her family story were no longer her responsibility. The adults were no longer her burden. And the silence that remained wasn't abandonment. It was alignment. She began to understand something she hadn't been able to see before. For years she had been confusing usefulness with love. She believed being needed was the same as being valued. But love that only exists when you are sacrificing yourself isn't love, it's dependence wearing a familiar face. Some evenings, Claire still thought about the wedding. The lights, the applause, the way the room had celebrated something built on her quiet labor without ever acknowledging it. But the memory no longer burned. It simply existed. A marker in time. A moment when the truth finally became impossible to ignore. She didn't lose a house that night. She lost an illusion, and in return she gained something far more permanent. She gained ownership of her own life. God's justice didn't arrive as punishment. It arrived as balance, as consequence, as clarity. No one was struck down. No one was publicly shamed. Everyone was simply left to live with exactly what they chose, and for the first time, Claire wasn't the one cushioning the fall. Her parents learned what it meant to give without a safety net. Her sister learned what it meant to carry responsibility instead of entitlement. And Claire learned what it meant to stand still while the world adjusted around her boundaries. That is real justice. Not loud, not cruel, not vengeful, just honest. One quiet night, as Claire turned off the lights and prepared for bed, she paused by the window. The city outside was alive, imperfect, steady, moving forward. She placed her hand against the glass, feeling grounded in a way she never had before. She whispered a quiet prayer, not for forgiveness, not for reconciliation, but for gratitude. Gratitude that she had finally listened to the part of herself that said enough. Gratitude that she had chosen truth over comfort. Gratitude that she had stopped shrinking so others could feel taller. This story doesn't end with applause. It ends with peace. And peace, Claire knew now, was the clearest sign that justice, real justice, had already been done. Silence has a price, and for a long time I didn't realize how much I was paying. I told myself I was being mature, responsible, loving. I told myself that staying quiet kept the peace, that swallowing disappointment was just part of being the dependable one. But silence doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It accumulates. It settles into your body, your choices, your sense of worth. It teaches people what they can take from you without consequence. And one day, if you're paying attention, you realize that what you've been calling peace is really just the absence of your own voice. For years, I believed responsibility meant sacrifice without an expiration date, that being capable meant being endlessly available. That love was proven by how much discomfort you could endure without complaint. But responsibility is not meant to erase you. It's not meant to turn your life into a resource other people can draw from indefinitely. True responsibility has limits. It knows when to step in and when to step back. And learning that difference changed everything for me. What I also learned, painfully but clearly, is that love and entitlement are not the same thing. Love respects boundaries. Love acknowledges effort. Love doesn't assume access just because it's familiar. Entitlement, on the other hand, thrives on silence. It grows when gratitude is replaced by expectation, when support becomes obligation, when sacrifice is no longer seen as a choice, but as something owed. Once I understood that, I stopped confusing guilt with loyalty. I stopped calling exploitation family duty. And I stopped believing that love required me to disappear. The justice that followed wasn't loud. It didn't come with shouting matches or dramatic ultimatums. It didn't require me to hurt anyone back. It arrived quietly, through boundaries that held and consequences that spoke for themselves. I didn't punish anyone. I didn't seek revenge. I simply stopped fixing what others broke and stopped cushioning the results of choices that weren't mine. And in that stillness, the truth settled where it belonged. There's a kind of justice that only appears when you step out of the way and let reality do its work. When you stop absorbing the impact meant for others. When you allow people to experience the natural outcome of their decisions. That justice isn't cruel. It's corrective. And it doesn't leave you bitter. It leaves you free. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's this: sometimes the strongest revenge isn't confrontation, punishment, or proving a point. Sometimes the strongest revenge is refusing to be used again. It's saying no without explanation. It's choosing yourself without apology. It's walking away from roles that were never meant to be permanent. This story doesn't end with anger. It ends with clarity, with empowerment, with a peace that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. And once you taste that kind of peace, you realize it was never something you needed permission to have.